dear Bagginses and Boffins.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we are talking about the absence of Sauron in The Lord of the Rings Season 1 and how it might cause a pacing issue. So this is going to be news to a lot of people. I mean, we have already been told a little bit that Sauron is going to... There's hints that Sauron will be involved in the Amazon Lord of the Rings TV series. However, how that comes about is still not clear, and it seems more and more that he will not be in Season 1. And some people are worried that that might make it boring, or that might make it kind of disconnected from Season 2, in which we then see Sauron come in and have to deal with that situation. So I don't know. I'm kind of mixed on this particular article here. I do feel like there is a way in which you can have a story that has a villain that is not on screen all the time, but is the stuff that happens on screen, it's directly because of them, and the characters allude to that, and that's how you keep the villain involved in the characters' lives without having them come in every episode and have a battle.
Yeah.
Obviously, with a movie, it is much different because you're building towards that end battle at the close of each movie of Lord of the Rings. There's going to be some sort of final battle that is somehow directly involved in the main antagonists of that particular movie. However, in Fellowship, we don't, like, Sauron is not directly involved, but his orcs are involved, and in that way, we still do feel that connection to the villain that we are trying to overcome. So I do think that it's not going to necessarily be a problem. Maybe that's just my optimism.
Maybe it'll be better. I don't know. The talk about that with like Jaws and stuff too. How you don't really
That's a good point.
They do a lot of you don't really see the shark. It's just the camera work and the tension. And
well, and exactly. And to continue on that point, if you had Sauron or something like him come into each episode and be defeated, when you get to the end of the season or into Season 2, are you really going to have any sort of sinister tones with this villain? You're going to think this villain's a joke because they keep getting defeated every episode. Or like they come into the episode and they don't do much like that. You don't want your villain to have nothing, no powers, nothing, and kind of feel weak. So
you're making me think of the Night King from Game of Thrones.
There you go. So exactly, you have a villain that you allude to but never does anything, and you kind of keep cutting back to them each episode doing nothing, and then when you do meet them they do nothing, and you're just like, this is such a nothing villain.
But then we also had a nothing hero.
And that was the downfall of Game of Thrones. We had no heroes to root for by the end. The plot was completely stripped away into just CGI battles, and we couldn't see those CGI battles too. And yeah, that's not what we want. And something that this article talks about, that they kind of they have it framed in a negative, which is that the Amazon TV series might have just a lot of long narratives.
We'll get to know the characters better maybe before we jump into the action. We can
Okay, so I want to ask the writer of this article, did they think that it was a long narrative, the intro to the Fellowship? I mean, that's just a big Hobbit party and nothing happens. Like, I obviously love those scenes, but they would feel like nothing happens because there's no villain. There's just, hobbits having a good time, Gandalf coming there being a disturber of the peace, like all this fun stuff. And you get to know the characters. They would be like, hey, where's the villain? You don't have the villain in the first, 45 minutes of the movie? What's going on?
Yeah, well, and I'd say that maybe on a first viewing you might think that actually, but when you watch the movies over and over and over again, then you'll appreciate even more that first 45 minutes of Hobbit stuff. You like it.
Perhaps. I mean, the thing is, it is obviously hard for me to think back and say, what was my very first viewing of the Fellowship of the Ring like, and how did I feel about those scenes? I believe that my first impression was that it was actually a great pacing decision, because we had this really happy moment for these hobbits, and then as we start to understand the scope and magnitude of their situation. It puts it all into perspective. If you just come in and have Gandalf come flying in and be like, "Oh, where's the ring? Oh, what's going on?" and like you get no real perspective of what that group of people were normally like. And
Yeah, when he's talking later in the movie when they're talking about missing the Shire, you understand what they're missing, and
yeah, because you miss
that
it
was
too.
awesome.
Yeah, like you kind of miss that type of those characters. Like those characters are gone because we now have these characters that have been warped by their situations, either by the ring or by war or a number of things. So I think that being able, like you said, to flesh out these characters in long narratives in the first season and have a background evil that is dwelling, which is what I think is so great about the Lord of the Rings trilogy, is that we know there's evil. It's in the background and it's coming. And we're trying to deal with that situation. We don't need every episode to be like, oh, here's an orc army you got to fight, or here's these guys. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you want to be able to just have these characters be in the moment and actually deal with their situations as they unfold, and not force these villains randomly popping up just to have a sense of battle.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can see it causing pacing issues. Obviously, if you just have nothing happen, like the characters don't have any real growth, we don't learn anything new, yeah, it will feel like a kind of a filler episode. And that's not, you should not be spending this kind of money on filler episodes. The amount of money that they're spending on this TV series, each episode needs to be jam-packed with as much details from the Lord of the Rings lore and Middle Earth and all of that you can fit into it. And so I think they do still have work to do, but I do think that there is a very good way in handling this that might end up making this actually feel like that original trilogy that we're all trying to get back to.
Yep.
So yeah, and as I think we mentioned this to ourselves just before we turned on the recording, but we don't actually see Sauron that much in the entire trilogy. We see him in the little intro scenes of each movie, and then we see the eye. We don't really, he's not there talking to the camera doing a bunch of stuff, but we understand based on what's happening around us that he's the cause of this, and so he is still a part of the movies even when he's not there. And I think that's something important to keep in mind, especially if they're going to be jumping around different locations like they end up doing by the second and third movies in the original trilogy. When you have the characters are spread out, you still need to be aware of who you're fighting and what their connection to Sauron is, because especially in movie 2, Saruman becoming a villain, that could easily get super confusing to people, especially because their names sound the exact same.
Yes.
And so being able to understand the relationship of Sauron and Saruman, and how the villains that you're fighting at Helm's Deep are different than the armies we fought elsewhere at, even way back when you fought them in the
Uruk-hai,
the Uruk-hai, and then you have fights in Minas Tirith that are different. These are all different groups, and it's important to keep them in perspective of the true villains of the movie. But yeah, I'm excited to see what they do with this. I actually do like a bit more of a narrative-driven story, especially if it's going to be set in this sort of Lord of the Rings lore, Middle Earth backdrop. So I'm excited for it. I don't need battles all the time. They need to make sure that they learn the lessons from Game of Thrones, that battles need to actually make sense through the narrative and not force them.
Yes.
And that's one thing that, to me, The Witcher is always compared to Game of Thrones, and I think that's an unfair comparison because that one does sort of have a battle each episode. It's almost like a detective show where he's just like a detective, like doing a random, he's figuring out what the villain is that episode, and that's completely different from a true overarching narrative show. I know The Witcher tries to blur the lines, but I think with especially with Lord of the Rings, you do want to make sure you are erring on the side of full story immersion and not just like who's the villain this week or who's the battle, what's the battle today. Like that's not gonna help the show.
Well, that would feel like filler, actually.
Exactly. And I think when we talk about The Hobbit, I think we often say a few of those battle scenes are a bit feel like a bit filler or feel a bit forced in the way that they're done and in the length of them, because those are long movies.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's about wraps it up for this one. Let us know in the comments down below, what are your feelings towards this? Do you need Sauron in the first season? Do you need a battle in each episode? We'd like to know and see what the community feels in terms of how to pace this show properly.
I regret to announce this is the end. I bid you all a very fond farewell.